Today we're going to talk about bilingual education. Most teacher of the deaf education programs focus on oral education. The focus is to train teachers to develop students' oral and listening and oral skills. Canada does have bilingual training programs, but unfortunately, graduates from these programs often lack the necessary skills in language and other abilities necessary for a bilingual program. So today we are going to take a deeper dive into bilingual education programs. First, I'd like to give you a bit more information about me. I was born and raised in Saskatchewan. Obviously now I am with the University of Alberta. However, I was a teacher of the deaf for many years. First in a residential school for the deaf. After that, I taught for a community-based agency working with deaf adults. Following that, I took a number of short-term contracts covering maternity leaves for teachers in deaf programs. Then I worked for 17 years in a resource program supporting deaf and hard of hearing students. In that capacity, I had a number of staff that I supervised, including interpreters and other staff who supported the program and students. The students were very diverse. Some were in mainstream settings, some were oral, some were hard of hearing, some were profoundly deaf. Some had cochlear implants, some used hearing aids, and some used sign language. The Saskatchewan education system for deaf and hard of hearing students has truly deteriorated over the years. The reason for this has been the overwhelming support for the oral philosophy of programming, with little attention to bilingual programming. In 1991, a special committee was put in place to do a follow-up investigation of an earlier report. This Deaf Education Advisory Forum report was tasked to make recommendations. At this point, the Saskatchewan School for the Deaf was still operating and deaf students were attending at the time I was teaching there. The committee recommended that the School for the Deaf be closed. That programming was no longer needed. It said that all the students would benefit more from mainstream programming. As a result, the school was closed. The committee also recommended that an ASL pilot project be put in place to determine the effectiveness of this kind of programming, but that was never implemented. So this meant that ASL as a language and programming in ASL for students was basically eliminated. The importance of oralism, that kind of programming, was paramount, as seen by deaf education. The report produced by the task force had about 70 recommendations to improve the oral education of deaf students. No regard was given to bilingual or sign language education, only the oral approach. They were able to manufacture almost 70 recommendations for that one approach. Of all the 70 recommendations, only the closure of the School for the Deaf was implemented. None of the other recommendations were implemented, so even the oral programming suffered too. The students who had been at the school, some for many years, were left in a lurch. Some transferred to the School for the Deaf in Alberta, and some to the school in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Not just the students left. The deaf teachers left, they were laid off. The deaf staff were laid off as well, and they left. And the deaf TAs were laid off, and as a result, had to leave the province in search of employment in other provincial schools. So the schools in Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland were all shut down. The remaining schools in other provinces then became treasures that we needed to preserve. So now we are still living with the legacy of a 30-year-old policy. Deaf education practice and policy have not kept up with the research. Oralism is still prominent. While services are highly developed to support oral deaf children, it's still the same old recipe. The focus is on students' devices and technology. Itinerant audiologists visit the schools to ensure that the technology is properly calibrated to the classroom environment. Speech-language pathologists work with the students. Well, maybe sometimes. Supports for children who use sign language is sporadic and unplanned. Parents have to fight tooth and nail to get services. The system overwhelmingly puts resources into oral programming and marginalizes sign language program. It's seen as the last resort, so it's not properly resourced. Deaf education programming continues to hire unqualified and untrained interpreters. You may recall in one of my other lectures, I said that if the classroom interpreter is weak and disfluent in ASL, this will cause language deprivation in the student. Regardless if the programming is oral or signing, if the child is not provided the necessary whole language input, it will lead to language deprivation. Parents and other professionals brought complaints to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission regarding deaf education. The commission collected loads of information on a broad scale, conducted interviews, hosted meetings, and published its report in 2016. The primary concern of the parents and the professionals was that there was no programming available in sign language for deaf children. And what's changed since that report was issued? Not a thing. They continue with the status quo. What's interesting is that Indigenous deaf children will be left totally unsupported in their northern communities. Immigrant children are not served either. Children with different cultures and different needs require deaf education teachers with different backgrounds, skills, and experiences. The same year that the Human Rights Commission was writing its report, a new agency was established, the Saskatchewan Advocacy for Children and Youth. We researched its mandate and wanted to find out more. It's an interesting story how this agency got established. The service was established in response to the death of a 16-year-old deaf Indigenous youth who was in custody. He had no language, no sign language, no spoken language, no language at all. He couldn't communicate. While in custody, overnight, he began to feel ill. He communicated that to the staff, but they dismissed the situation, thinking he was fine, and sent him back to his room. I don't know, maybe they gave him some Tylenol. During the night, he died. He couldn't communicate the severity of his illness. While there was a sign language interpreter only 15 minutes away from the facility, the staff refused to call one in, or they didn't know how to reach an interpreter. An interpreter could have been there, likely could have helped. It was neglect on the part of the system. Keep in mind, this young man was Indigenous, and we know that Indigenous populations are poorly served. The system benefits white people. Another relevant court case took place in Moose Jaw, a small city in Saskatchewan. This young deaf boy received a cochlear implant, auditory training, speech training, but at the age of 9, he still had no language. He was not able to communicate. So, not unsurprisingly, as a result, his behavior was out of control. He was purposefully physically harming others, as well as harming himself. In response, the school built a padded cell to put him in when he lost control. The mother repeatedly asked the professionals, the teachers, audiologists, speech language therapists, whether he could learn sign language, since he hadn't progressed at all in English. They all said, oh no, we can't do that. They still had to work hard with him on his speech and his hearing. The mother became increasingly frustrated and one day took the son's cochlear implant external processor and smashed it to bits with a hammer. To replace the entire system would have cost about $20,000. The Department of Health and the Department of Social Services stepped in and essentially charged her as an unfit mother. It went to court. The deaf community was involved and argued that the child had no language, and the mother was simply trying to get the child to learn sign language. The judge, who was listening to the case, asked that the child be tutored in sign language before providing his ruling. So a deaf man was hired to work with the student one-to-one. The student picked up ASL very quickly. He became a different kid. After seeing this, the judge wrote in his ruling that the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Social Services, and the Ministry of Education had failed the child. This was a huge step forward in recognizing that sign language had a place in deaf education. After the closure of the Saskatchewan School for the Deaf, the deaf community essentially became a diaspora. Let's look at what I mean by diaspora. On this map of Western and Central Canada, I have plotted the relative sizes of the deaf communities for the major centers. BC has a large population of deaf people. Many deaf people actually moved to BC. In Alberta, Edmonton, we have a relatively large community. Calgary's population is smaller. In Saskatchewan, you can see here the numbers are low, much lower than when the School for the Deaf was open. In Manitoba, there's a fairly healthy population there. And Ontario has a very large population of deaf people. Schools for the deaf in provinces are highly valued by the deaf communities, and they advocate to keep them open. Provinces with schools keep their culture strong, their language strong. The recognition of the rights of deaf citizens is stronger in those provinces. In Saskatchewan, deaf rights are not recognized. ASL is not recognized. The culture is weak. Recently, the situation has improved slightly, though it may be too little too late. Time will tell. So what do I mean by diaspora? It's the homing desire we feel when we are in another country. We miss the foods we're used to, the traditions, customs, beliefs, the people. We miss the connection we had to home. It's often hard to put down roots and really connect when we move somewhere different. That sense of belonging that we had at home is just not the same in the new environment. People in a diaspora experience what we call dispersal. And they spend a lot of effort on maintaining identity boundaries. They emphasize, for example, I'm not American. I'm not Canadian. I am African Canadian. I am Indian Canadian. Whatever combination you wish to use. It's important to them they maintain that connection. The same is true in the deaf community. They identify as deaf and advocate to protect that identity and deaf culture. They resist attempts by others or systems that would identify them otherwise. Dispersal for the deaf community is called inclusive education. They are completely disconnected from the community. Where in those school environments will a deaf child come in contact with a deaf adult, a deaf teacher? Where is there a community of similar others the child can belong to? Not belonging is unsettling. That's what I mean by diaspora. Currently in Saskatchewan, almost all deaf children are mainstreamed. Most deaf children have had cochlear implant surgery. Inclusive education means deaf children are placed in the deaf community. What am I saying? They are placed in their local schools, in their own communities. So if a child lives in North Battleford, they go to school there. There are no opportunities to have congregate classes. Saskatchewan has a dedicated cochlear implant clinic which works in partnership with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Health. The clinic has staff that will go into the schools with their fancy computers and calibrate the child's CI to the environment. This is done regularly because the CI changes over time. They might also make recommendations regarding the child to the school. School divisions deliver services at its own discretion and capacity. So one school board could offer ASL programming and another could refuse. They operate as independent entities, and the Ministry of Education has no authority to tell them what to offer, whether it's programming or services. There is a long-standing and pervasive lack of qualified and trained interpreters. In Saskatchewan, we have one. Just one qualified and trained interpreter working this school system. One for the entire province. Now, aren't our deaf kids lucky? A newer trend is the number of newcomer Canadian deaf students moving to Saskatchewan from other countries such as Syria, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Somalia. These students often arrive with no speaking skills. They haven't learned ASL, so what do you do with them? Another trend is the high percentage of Indigenous students that have hearing losses. This is believed to be genetic. The signing we see can be non-standard varieties, which incorporate signed English, gesture, signs from other sign languages, but it's definitely non-standard. Unfortunately, to this day, we see extreme polarization in deaf education. The oral approach, with its emphasis on speaking English and placements in mainstream environments, which is highly resourced, versus the ASL English bilingual program or approach, which is highly marginalized. During your studies in this course, and as you learn ASL, you will become more aware of how oppressed the deaf community is, how they continually must fight and advocate for their space, deaf space, for their ways of knowing, fight for their role in deaf education. We will also talk about deaf literature, and I look forward to inviting you into the unique world of the deaf.